Now, from CBS News Miami, this is Facing South Florida with Jim DeFede.
Welcome to Facing South Florida. I'm Jim DeFede. Last month, the Miami Herald and the Tampa Bay Times published an explosive story revealing that the state's Office of Insurance Regulation, known as OIR, had written a report in 2022 claiming that while some insurance companies were complaining they were going broke and therefore needed a rate increase, there was evidence these companies may have hidden their profits by transferring money into so-called affiliate companies. That draft 2022 report was never finished or delivered to legislators. And when the newspaper tried to get a copy of the report, they were stonewalled and misled for years. In response to the story, House Speaker Danny Perez launched an investigation into what happened, directing the House Insurance and Banking Committee to hold a special hearing to try and get answers.
You know, our purpose today is to find out if insurance companies have been allegedly ripping us off, ripping the citizens of Florida off. Why rates are so high. We want to find that out. And this report's the state's attempt at determining the answer to that. Yet it's still in draft form. It's only 7 pages long. It deals with data from 2017 to 2019. Today's 2025. And I find it as a legislator, that's outrageous.
The problem with managing general agents and their affiliates has existed in this state for a very long time. How does the office justify receiving this report that seemed to indicate $14 billion went to affiliates and they just dropped the ball because they were too busy?
2 witnesses were called before the committee, the state's current insurance commissioner, Mike Jaworski, and the insurance commissioner when the report was written, David Altmaier. Neither had very good answers, especially to the question why the report was never finished.
And who stopped this work, Commissioner?
We have looked hard and fast. I do not know.
Why did the investigation stop? Why didn't we get a completed report? What happened? Who made that decision to say this isn't important enough?
So I would say that nobody made that decision. And candidly, when I was asked to come and speak here today, that's the one question that I haven't been able to come up with an answer to, because candidly speaking, I thought the work was continuing. I really thought that as we had these conversations at a staff level, that the understanding was that we were going to go and address the concerns that we had in the draft report. So my recollection at the time is that we were going to continue that work.
Many legislators complain they should have had this information when they were deciding what laws to pass.
I think we have all raised questions about these premiums and the rates climbing repeatedly, and so clearly we didn't know, and you had the opportunity to share this with us. I guess my question still is, why didn't you?
To share the report with you?
To share the problem with us that the insurers were transferring money to the affiliates, making their company look broke and raising the rates of our citizens. That.
I understand what you're saying, but I think the supposition in that would be that the transfer of money itself was making the company broke, and I don't think that that's established within any record we have.
And therein lies the problem. If you don't look for the answers, you're not going to find them. In fact, the existence of this report would have never been public if it wasn't for the reporter who kept pressing for answers. Asked why the report wasn't made public when the reporter asked for it more than 2 years ago, here is Commissioner Jaworski's rambling response.
There seems to have been a request made in 2022, and that request was there was I think a written response provided to the reporter that it was not an open record at that point. And then there is a period of time where there seems to be mostly verbal, some email follow-up between the reporter and our comms director at that time, following up on the request, or renewing the request might be the better term. And it wasn't various answers, a lot of what seems to be verbal communication, not written communication, as to what the circumstances of that discussion are. But I think it is important to acknowledge that that was not a perfect process.
After the hearing, I spoke to State Representative Hillary Cassel, who pressed for answers during that hearing.
I think my main takeaway from that is obviously we still have a lot of unanswered questions that we were, there was a report that had really damaging information. The former commissioner of insurance talked about how that report had red flags, there was smoke, there was fire, there was a lot of information contained within that report that was really that the legislature really could have relied on to look into this years before. And because the report was not produced to anybody or not even discussed with anybody, we weren't able to. So we need to get to the bottom of why that was. And I think when we need to gather some additional information either to uncover that.
It seemed as if they were both the current commissioner and the former commissioner seemed to sort of argue that it was just sort of a bureaucratic, it fell through the cracks kind of thing. Do you accept that?
Absolutely not. This is a problem that we've known historically has plagued the marketplace when we look at these managing general agents and their affiliates, dating back, as I mentioned in my testimony, back to as early as 2009 with a report from the Insurance Consumer Advocate. We know several insurance, we know an insurance company has been fined for this type of abusive behavior. We know insurance companies have gone insolvent for this type of behavior. So saying that this fell through the cracks at a time where we really needed to figure out what was happening in our insurance market and why we were in this crisis is definitely not an okay answer for me.
There was a special session, there have been several special sessions, but there was a special session in 2022 that generated Senate Bill 2A, which you talked about during the hearing. You described it as hostile to consumers and that it was basically a gift to the insurance industry. Tell me a little bit about what that bill did and why you believe that was the case.
Yeah, so several of the reforms that were passed were pieces of legislation that I had fought against as a consumer advocate coming to Tallahassee, advocating for everyday Floridians on this issue for years. And when you would see this bill come through the committee process where consumers had an opportunity to present and legislators really had an opportunity to vet these individual pieces of legislation out, oftentimes they fail to make it through the committee process. But when it's put through in a special session situation, usually that means that's the legislation that's going to pass. And what the reforms really did was focus on all the tools I always say David has to hold Goliath responsible. One of those being the one-way attorney's fees. There was some good pieces of the legislation that passed, abolishing, in my opinion, the assignment of benefits. I think that's where a lot of the abuses in that system came from. But many of the pieces of that legislation specifically targeted consumers and their access to hold insurance companies accountable. And there wasn't anything on the other side of the coin in that particular piece of legislation.
So again, just so we're clear about the timetable and the players, at the time that this report was written in a draft form and never completed, but at the time that it was written and delivered in March of 2022, David Altmaier was the insurance regulator, was the head of the commissioner over insurance for the state of Florida. That special session that occurred later that year in 2022, he advocated for that very bill that we were just talking about, Senate Bill 2A, which you said was a gift to the insurance industry. After that bill passed in the special session, you noted that it was 24 hours later that he essentially resigned on December 28th, 2022, to go and now work as a lobbyist for the insurance industry. And you suggested that there may have been a connection there. Do you believe that there was wrongdoing, or do you think that David Altmaier's actions should be investigated for possible wrongdoing there?
I think we are investigating to get to the bottom of that. At the end of the day, those pieces all line up together. I'm a trial lawyer, right? You need pieces of evidence to get to a final destination of what a verdict is. And I think we're missing some major pieces with regards to making that allegation. But I think looking into the timing and how this draft, or what's being coined as a draft piece, draft report that we spent $150,000 on to get that had red flags, smoke, and fire, but then never saw the light of day. We've got to figure out if there was any motive or agenda as to why that was. And I don't think we have the answers to that yet. Again, we're still in that fact-finding mission. And I know the Speaker of the House is absolutely dedicated to continuing this mission and continuing this investigation to where the pieces might lead us.
The consultant who was hired for that $150,000 to prepare this report, raising serious concerns that basically there were insurance companies that were hiding their money, hiding profits in their affiliates, and therefore then could present that they were losing money when in fact they were just hiding the money that they were making in Florida. The consultant who wrote that report, why not subpoena that person, find out what they were told and why they didn't continue their work?
Listen, we just wrapped up round one. I think there's a lot more for us to do, and I think that's definitely a conversation that we are having as to what our next step is. I think looking into whether they believed that report was a draft is crucial to answer some of these questions. Do they believe they submitted a complete report that was worthy of further investigation? I think those questions are valid questions for this committee to ask. I think you should stay tuned and see round two.
It seems like the brunt of what the legislature has done up till now has been really on the issue of tort reform, insulating insurance companies from lawsuits, making it harder for individuals to sue insurance companies that they think are not quickly or adequately paying on claims. And that may still have been an issue. And I think that's one of the things that sort of I took away from this hearing is that may have played a role, but this may have also been a factor. And by putting all the emphasis on the litigation portion that really stripped consumers, you didn't look at as you were just saying, the conduct of the insurance companies themselves. Is that a fair way to say it?
That's exactly how I would say it. And again, before I was elected and I was coming up here as a consumer advocate, I always advocated for reforms to the consumer side. There were definitely loopholes that needed to be closed and that there were abuses on that side of the equation. But what always frustrated me in my conversations with legislators is, but it takes two to tango. And when are we going to take a look at why claims are being denied? Why has litigation increased so much? It can't just be because consumers now all of a sudden have these claims and want to file lawsuits.
Additional hearings are expected in the weeks ahead. Now, when we come back, we will talk to State Senator Ana Maria Rodriguez about the state starting its own DOGE movement. Stay with us. Welcome back. Republican State Senator Ana Maria Rodriguez represents South Dade and the Florida Keys. Last week, I spoke to her about the state's continuing effort to do away with DEI initiatives. But we started with the governor's call for his own DOGE task force.
One of the things that I think voters made very loud and clear during the last election cycle is that they want leaders who are going to be efficient and responsible with their taxpayer dollars. That's, I think, part of the reason why Donald Trump had such a sweeping victory around the entire country, particularly here in Florida. When you look at those types of numbers and you say, okay, this is more than an election. This is a mandate from the people. People want efficiency. They want transparency, and they want to see that their dollars are not being misspent. So obviously, we're seeing the DOGE, taking place at the federal level, and there's been some mixed reactions to that. A lot of longstanding programs that have been in place for decades are being cut, without any hesitation. Obviously, USAID. And so, Governor DeSantis, as well as the Florida legislature, has taken note and said, you know what, this is something that we believe our electorate and the people of Florida also deserve to have a closer look taken at the monies that we spend here, and not just go year after year, budget cycle after budget cycle, funding things that maybe don't make sense. Let's take a closer look at what's working, what's not working. And then the things that are working well, I think we'll continue investing in. And maybe even spend a little more money into those projects and those programs that are helping a lot of people and that are making a big impact in our communities. But the ones that really aren't working as well and perhaps need to be phased out, those are the ones that we're going to be more than likely eliminating over the next budget cycle.
And I don't think anybody advocates for inefficient government. I think everyone is in favor of efficiency and making sure that dollars are being wisely spent. I think the concern that you're seeing at the federal level, and I think the concern that you're going to likely see at the state level, is that what one person defines as inefficient may be more based on ideology. Do you find those things that you politically oppose to be used that as a way of claiming that it's inefficient? I think, when you look at you mentioned USAID, that seems to be as much about political positions and ideology than it does about actual inefficiency. That my concern is that when the governors and his task force says that he's going to go after cities and particularly then universities, is it then just trying to purge from universities programs and courses that don't fit within his ideology? How do you balance that so that it's just not an ideology purity test that you're actually embarking on?
Well, those are all great points, Jim. And actually, touching on the USAID topic real quick before we transition to the state, I know people who are in the USAID who have been receiving money from USAID and some programs like Radio Marti and TV Marti, which is really a right-leaning organization and right-leaning to try to help people in Cuba to learn about, what's happening in, around the world and, more, democratic points of view. That whole institution was completely defunded by President Trump, which I'm not in agreement with. I think that was a program that was working well, but perhaps maybe it's outlived its utility, right? Maybe people aren't really watching it or even listening to it as much. I think you're right. It needs to be looked at not just through a is this a liberal thing or is it functioning? Period. It shouldn't be looked at through a political lens. Again, it needs to be looked through an efficiency lens, and I think that's where things need to be evaluated, right? Not from a political standpoint.
On the state level, though, you were going to then pick up on the idea. My concern again is that this is going to become an excuse to go after universities even more in terms of some of the courses they offer, or even just looking at other issues that may not fit within an ideological viewpoint that the governor has.
Yes, and I think that's why we have a checks and balances system, is because we see obviously that the governor has his views, he has his objectives that he wants to accomplish. But thankfully, the legislature is at a point, we're at an inflection point where, we're not necessarily just rubber stamping everything that Governor DeSantis wants to accomplish. We take a very close look at programming, again, not through the political spectrum, but mainly from is this working for Floridians? Is this something that's, in the example of the universities, as you mentioned, is this something that Florida students, need? Is this the highest and best use of the dollars that they're receiving at the universities? And really and truly, and again, not looking at it from a leftist or right side. Mainly, is this something that is being well spent and on something that is going to take our kids to the next level professionally in their careers and through their educational goals and objectives.
Well, this segues nicely into a vote that you took this week in a committee on a bill relating to banning DEI in certain areas. Explain to me why you think the notion of DEI is a problem, diversity, equity, inclusion, why that's a problem in the state of Florida that the legislature needs to address.
I think that we've fallen into this sort of a trap of thinking that the DEI is the cure all and the be all of all things, and in reality people back in the day, and I think I think people are starting to want to see a more merit-based system. And not a system where you basically just check boxes off and say, you fit this, and this, category. People are not, I don't think, are meant to be put into these types of categories. I think people, want to be evaluated based on, their knowledge, based on their ability to do a job or their ability to accomplish something. And I think when you start transitioning back into a more merit-based system, I think it creates more competition. It creates a way that you see more progress, and things just actually are overall better. And that's one of the things that makes America great, is that we've always had a very competitive and a very merit-based system here in our country.
I guess it depends on how you define merit in a lot of ways. I would imagine that as a Hispanic female, you have certain experiences, certain knowledge, certain abilities that I might not have as a older white male. I'm not saying that you should have unqualified people, and I think that's the real concern with the anti-DEA movement, is the DEI movement, is that the assumption is that if something comes along through DEI, they're not qualified. That there's almost a presumption that women and minorities are not qualified, and so they have to have this leg up. That's not the case. It's just sort of talking about it in a broader sense. Give me your perspective.
So you made a very good point about, for example, you and I fit different boxes, right? But for example, I wouldn't want to be hired just because I check the box of female, Hispanic, so on and so forth. For example, the fact that I'm bilingual, the fact that I can bring an additional resource to an institution, to a job, to a position, to an elected position, I say, okay, I can speak English, I can speak Spanish, I can communicate fluently. That is an aspect of my culture. That's something that I bring to the table, but I would not want to be, and I don't think most people want to be hired or brought into an organization just because their skin color fits a certain box that someone needs to check in a human resources department. I think people in general want to feel valued because of what they bring to the table in terms of their experience, in terms of their knowledge, their all the other things that I think complete and make people want to work somewhere or want to be somewhere.
Nobody's suggesting ever hiring somebody unqualified simply because they check a box, but that those boxes sometimes can become part of the evaluation system to say, do we have enough perspective? Do we have enough and different voices in our organization?
Diversity is important. I don't think any institution should just be all males or tipping one way or another. It should be balanced, but at the end of the day, that should be second to the qualification aspect. And then looking at the other aspect, like you said, that the diversity, I'm not saying it's not important. It's just, I think the qualification aspect comes first.
One of the bills I know that you're working on is SB 1020, which deals with property insurance. What would your bill do, and what are some of the steps that you think are likely to pass this year in the legislative session on property insurance?
What it would do is it would raise the coverage threshold for citizens' property insurance from $1 million to $1.5 million, particularly in Monroe County, which I represent down in the Florida Keys. Reason being, the property values in Monroe County start at a much higher threshold, and so the citizens' coverage is really it's not cutting it. So if we raise the threshold to $1.5 million, that would allow for some more property owners down in Monroe County to be able to qualify for citizens.
We'll be right back after the break. Well, that's all the time we have today. If you have any thoughts or comments, feel free to contact me at jdefede@cbs.com. I do enjoy hearing from you. Thanks again for watching, and enjoy the rest of your day.